Last time on Pac-Marathon, we saw the yellow fellow and his missus return to their roots in maze exploration and ghost chomping. Now it's time for the moment you've all been waiting for. These games have an exceptionally passionate fan base, and out of everything we've played so far, I've got my hopes pretty high for these titles. So let's jump into the trilogy of Pac-Man World games, starting with the very first, celebrating its 20-year history. Before we can really dive into Pac-Man World though, believe it or not, we kinda have to talk about another Pac-Man game first, Pac-Man Ghost Zone. Ghost Zone was a 3D platformer that was being developed by Namco Home Tech, a smaller subsidiary of Namco based in the States. They're certainly no strangers to the Yellow Dude, considering they're the ones who developed all the Pac-Man SNES games we covered in episode 2. Now before I jump in, I do want to clarify a lot of this is based on various info given from former developers, and there are some very conflicting bits of info, and especially conflicting attitudes, so take this tale with a grain of salt or two. The story goes that Namco gave Home Tech a series of projects to pick from, and when they picked an RPG featuring classic Namco characters, Namco said, no, you're doing Pac-Man. Side note, would have loved to play an RPG for the marathon just for some variety. I wish I could see what that project may have looked like. So, against their own wishes, Home Tech started working on Pac-Man Ghost Zone, but despite forcing them to work on the project, Namco was super worried about Home Tech using the character. They were so terrified, they told Home Tech, hey, you know that Pac-Man game we asked for? Yeah, could you just not use the real Pac-Man? Okay, thanks, bye! So instead, you were going to play as a kid who insults a Pac-Man arcade machine, angering the ghosts and causing them to suck the boy inside and turn him into Pac-Man? And Namco Home Tech really did not need any help from the main office to make the project difficult. Most of them had only had a bit of experience making games, let alone a fully 3D one. And yet, Namco refused to let them hire any outside help that may have assisted them with the project. When the team ended up presenting the game, Namco was furious, and the then president wanted to shut down not just the project, but the entire studio. Thankfully, he was convinced to let them continue. But it just kept getting worse. Development time was cut in half, employees were fired abruptly, and finally, after a second meeting, the entire project was cancelled. Looking at screenshots and promotional videos, I can't say I'm too disappointed. The concept is weird, but admittedly unappealing to me. It gives off some sort of like Goosebumps-esque horror for kids kind of vibe. And the gameplay, the gameplay. 3D open environments with tank controls, just like a certain Bobcat's horrendous jump into the third dimension. Considering the turbulent development of Ghost Zone, I think we're lucky that Pac-Man World was even finished. Fortunately, a lot of the work on the game could be carried over, and even some of the music tracks for World are ripped straight from Ghost Zone. The plot has been completely changed though, and the game focuses more on exploring and fleshing out Pac-Man's world. It's Pac-Man's 20th birthday, and all of his pals are here to celebrate. However, the birthday boy returns home to find all of his friends mysteriously missing and his home scattered with party invites. Ghost Island is having a huge rager, and you can even meet Pac-Man in person. Armed with this clue, Pac sets sail to Ghost Island to search for his friends and solve the mystery of the guest appearance he's supposed to make, while this mechanical imposter, Talkman, prepares for the real Pac's arrival. It took me forever to figure out the joke behind this dude's name. So, Talkman is actually Namcot, just flipped around. You may remember Namcot as the subsidiary that did the arcade to home console ports from episode 2. So, it may be weird to see Pac-Man's family in just a random Puka from Dig Dug, but initially the game was going to see Pac-Man rescue just other Namco characters, like Mappy and Dig Dug. Puka's presence is just a leftover from this original idea. The game begins right where the cutscene left off, with Pac-Man landing on the island. It's a minor detail, sure, but I absolutely love that it begins so seamlessly. There aren't many more cutscenes in Pac-Man World, just the intro scenes and a final one at the end, but they're surprisingly well made. The presentation overall is done pretty well. I'd even say it sometimes looked a bit better than Maze Madness, which released not too long thereafter. The levels just feel like they're built with a lot of really nice set pieces that make them feel more like a real place than just a platforming challenge. Well, as real as it can feel to jump through space stations and a fun house as a yellow sphere with legs. I will admit the game struggles a bit with level themes. The first areas are mostly pirate and beach theme. Makes perfect sense. You've just arrived on Ghost Island after all. Then you've got ruins and caves. Cool. Then we're just hopping into rockets and flying into space. It's not terrible, but it definitely does undermine what is a great introduction and kind of makes the world feel more gamey. The progression is pretty straightforward here. Each of the 6 worlds contains 3 levels and a single boss. Progression is initially a bit more open-ended, as you can do any of the first 3 worlds in whatever order you please, but it doesn't make too much of a difference, as you've got to beat all 3 in order to get past a barrier in the overworld to continue the game. The overworld here is a neat touch, but it's really just a glorified level select with a bit more wandering around. Clearing each stage is relatively simple. Run, jump, and swim through various obstacles until you reach the coin at the end. Pac-Man has 2 special moves to accomplish this that you'll be frequently using in your adventure. Anytime you're in the air, you can press jump again to slam onto the ground and do another quick bounce upwards. This lets you attack enemies and activate switches, but it also makes some platforming generally less tedious. Instead of having to land on the ground and time button presses when, say, climbing upstairs, you can just butt bounce to more quickly reach the top. It may not sound like much, but being able to kind of queue up a jump at any time in the air is a game changer. Combine this with the fact that you can string them together, and it can make clearing gaps not just easy, but feel really satisfying. The rev roll, unfortunately, doesn't serve this same utility. You can stop in place and charge up a quick dash forward, letting you ascend steep slopes, activate certain platforms, or just zip around. It's much weaker in terms of general utility, which is why I think these rev roll elevators exist. Dashing forward is rarely ever useful, except for when it's specifically required to use a ramp or something. If you want to rush through levels, the time lost charging up kind of negates any potential time saves. Plus, there's the additional possibility of rev rolling straight into a hazard or bottomless pit. Its only frequent use is stopping and starting moving platforms to avoid danger. Seriously, they use this challenge constantly. It's not as great as the butt bounce, but that's to be expected in these smaller, more cramped environments. With these 2 special moves and a solid jump, reaching the final goal is never too complex a task for our round hero. The real depth comes in the form of all the hidden collectibles and goodies in each level. Of course, you've got your health pickups and extra lives, which can be a godsend so you don't have to restart particularly long levels all the way from the beginning, as well as dots, power pellets, and fruit to collect. Everything here will add to a total level score, but dots and fruit have some extra utility as well. You can throw dots you're carrying around as a projectile, even holding it down for a much larger blast. I won't lie, this was pretty useless, except for a later enemy that can't be jumped on. Fruits don't grant you any new ability, but rather act like keys to various doors around the levels, allowing you to access more dots and power pellets, extra lives, switches, and in some rare cases, level progression. You'll usually spot the door first, and then know to be on the lookout for a specific fruit. I do like this idea as you get a clear idea of what to look for, but a lot of the fruit may be in the middle of the path, and the only thing close to a puzzle is just having to travel backwards a little bit in the stage. These kind of feel a bit like needless fluff. Some of these fruit and doors can be really well hidden, and later levels tend to do this much better. Combing these levels for secrets just barely in view is really fun, and being able to open an otherwise locked door and figure out what's inside is rewarding. It's just a bit of a shame some of these instances just seem to kind of take your time rather than any amount of thought. In addition to fruit, you can also grab a single Galaxian per level. These will warp you to a bonus maze. They're alright, but considering you still lose health instead of instantly dying when colliding with ghosts, they're kind of just filler. There are also Pac-Man letters to grab in each stage, allowing you to access the bonus stage where you can win some extra lives and more fruit. Finally, each world will contain a single key hidden somewhere in a level, which is required to free one of Pac-Man's friends. You'll have to find all 6 and rescue all of them to take on Pac-Man. At the end of each level, the game tallies up your score, and depending on how many bonus fruit you collected, you can try to earn some extra lives at the slot machine. It's easy to skip these and press on, but trust me, you're going to need every single life you can get your hands on for some of this game's bosses. The first boss isn't too much of a challenge at all. Just platform well enough to reach the end and reflect the cannonballs for an easy victory. But this game spikes in difficulty like crazy from here. For those of you who either watch me stream this game on Twitch, twitch.tv/wizard441, or have played it yourself, you know the name Anubis Rex. It begins with a similar chase sequence of avoiding attacks, like the first boss, but these spears have ridiculous hitboxes. They're not even remotely the hard part though. Once you reach the end of this section, you have to jump around and rev roll to open up his hands and slam into his heart 4 times. Having to stand still long enough on each of these platforms is annoying as is, and leaves you in a vulnerable position far too many times. But each hit will add another increasingly difficult threat. By the end, it is a complete clusterfuck of random attacks that feels almost unavoidable at times. I absolutely would not blame anyone for getting stuck or just plain quitting here. This fight is absolutely brutal. I only managed to pull it off due to having enough health and trying to push through as quickly as possible. But as those of you who may have tuned into my stream saw, it took a lot of attempts. Anubis Rex may be the worst, but it doesn't get much better. King Galaxian is an awesome reference to Namco history, and makes for a fun change of pace, but my god, it can be just as hard. It suffers from the exact same problem with the later stages, creating these bullet hell nightmares that are really tough to survive long enough in to secure a victory. And does anyone remember the awful, horrendously slippery racing minigame in Miss Pac-Man Maze Madness I complained about? Because it's a boss now, and while it is slightly better, it is still right on the intersection of miserable and frustrating. Chrome Keeper, the 5th boss, can be annoying, but he's a walk in the park comparatively. None of these bosses are exceptionally great, except for the final fight. The game handles platforming way better than boss battles, but even that isn't without its quirks. Pac-Man World is really closer to a 2.5D platformer than a purely 3D one. It doesn't tend to emphasize the third dimension when platforming too much, save for a few specific instances, and for that reason, limited movement options and relatively simple physics get the job done just fine. But there are occasional cracks in this foundation, and I think the easiest place to spot this is in the Funhouse world, specifically these rotating circular platforms. It looks simple, just run to the edge and jump to the other, but whether you're on the top half or bottom half makes a huge difference. The direction and momentum from the spin of the platforms can help you reach the other side, or slow you down so you're just short of success. It makes what looks like a simple string of jumps require exceptional precision. I found I'd travel further if I actually started jumping when I was running up or down with the spin, and then beginning to move left or right. The gameplay tends to struggle when it leans on the third dimension, which may be why despite levels being 3D environments, they almost always tend to focus on your classic left or right traversal. Levels may change the dimension you're focusing on, like navigating up or down through tunnels when swimming or running in the back and foreground, but it typically follows the same beats as any good 2D platformer game. There aren't many 3D platformers like this, with Crash Bandicoot probably being the best example. Some have the classic 2D that switches between two planes, like Kirby Triple Deluxe, but 2 layers is quite different from the freely moving around a 3D environment. Despite being on the same hardware and being similarly designed, I do think it stands out from Crash Bandicoot, but I'll admit not by a large margin. I think Pac-Man World tends to play it a bit safer and stick to the tried and true traditional 2D level design in a 3D space, while something like Crash is a bit further towards full 3D on the scale between the two, especially with its chase sequences and more frequent swapping of focus between various directions. Despite a few rougher spots and some outrageously difficult bosses, the journey to Talkman manages to be a fun one. It's a step away from a traditional 2D platforming adventure, yet doesn't stray too far from one either. The battle with Talkman himself thankfully is the game's best. It'll require you to use every one of your abilities several times as the threat evolves and new weaknesses appear with each phase. Once you destroy the mechanical fraud, the true culprit is revealed. This little ghost is Orson, and he's created Talkman to steal Pac-Man's identity and in turn his popularity. Pac-Man gobbles up Orson, and just like that, the game's over. At first glance, that ending may not seem like much, but here's why I absolutely love this game's story and the ending especially. Okay, hold on to your butts. This ending solves absolutely nothing. Sure, Pac-Man's imposter is destroyed, his friends are all safe, but the underlying problems that caused this whole mess are completely ignored. Orson gets eaten, but he can obviously regenerate without any problem. This may seem like a bad thing, but it somehow manages to tie up the story of Pac-Man World with a conclusion, while also leading extremely well into a sequel. I mean, Orson is obviously devastated at his loss, and his plot was never done with real malice. I mean, listen to this guy.
Nobody loves a ghost.
He just felt lonely. I kind of felt sorry for the little dude and assumed Pac-Man might feel the same. But shockingly enough, Pac just gobbles him up and gets back to his birthday. His journey is over, but Orson's obviously not gonna forget this. And to make matters even more interesting, these two have a long backstory according to the designers of Pac-Man World. Initially, Pac-Man and Orson grew up together, but began to drift apart as Pac became the hero we know him as today. This led to Orson copying the actions of Pac-Man, but it only really led him to failure. As a last-ditch effort, he built a Pac-Dot factory, which did make him rich and led to him owning a mansion on Ghost Island, but it still wasn't enough for the guy. He's incredibly jealous of his friend's success. And after all they've been through, both their past friendship and the events of Pac-Man World, Pac-Man himself cements the severed connection by answering Orson's cry for help with a single loud chomp. And while all may seem well, Orson is not going to just change his ways. He's just going to begin to resent Pac-Man even more, and who knows what will happen as his jealousy and paranoia leads to hatred for the hero of Pac-World. Who knew Pac-Man of all franchises had such a deep, depressing story about a damaged relationship between friends?
Jesse, what the fuck are you talking about?
I mention this not just to praise a fascinating but easy to overlook plot, but also to complain about the fact that they immediately throw Orson into the garbage in Pac-Man World 2. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I do recommend you give this game a shot if you're interested. It's not the best platformer on the market, but it is a fun celebration of the series as a whole and a pretty good time overall. There are some more ways to play it, but the PlayStation 1 version is still your best bet. The GBA port is surprisingly faithful, but it's missing some levels and feels pretty clunky comparatively. There is a PC port, though only released in South Korea of all places. Supposedly this port was initially slated to release in every region, but for whatever reason this just didn't happen. I do love the box art though, and I would absolutely love to own this, but I cannot find a listing anywhere. In fact, I can't find a single picture of a physical copy. If anyone happens to know anything about it, please let me know. Now, as I've mentioned before, we're going slightly out of order in terms of release date. Really, Pac-Man World was released just before the Maze games of Episode 3, and between the first game and Pac-Man World 3, there are several party games and handheld-specific spin-offs too. I'll throw up a brief timeline for those of you who are interested for whatever reason, but I think keeping these sets of games grouped together by genre or platform instead of chronologically makes far more sense. So next up is Pac-Man World 2, released just 3 years later in 2002 and released on nearly every platform out there. Compared to the rocky start of Pac-Man World, World 2's development seems pretty uneventful. I suppose selling over 1 million copies convinced Namco to let Home Tech work in peace. Our creepy quartet are causing mischief in Pac Village one night when they begin playing with the golden fruit of the golden fruit tree. Real creative name, I know. Much to the surprise of the Ghost Gang, a primal evil known as Spooky is released from the tree. Spooky enlists the help of Blinky, Pinky, Inky, and Clyde to destroy the Pac people, and as evil conquest over Pac-Land begins, Professor Pac-Man tells our hero about the legend of Sir Pac-A-Lot, who's used the golden fruit to forever seal Spooky away. Now it's up to Pac-Man to journey across the world, collecting the stolen magic fruit, making his way ever closer to Spooky's hideout on Ghost Island. This plot is completely fine, it's just a little generic for my taste, especially considering it has nothing to do with the previous story other than name droppings in previous locations. Pac-Man World creates some really good tension for a possible continuation, and then it's all just thrown out. It's kinda hard not to be disappointed. Looking at Pac-Man World 2, the differences are pretty immediate. Rather than the previous compromise between 2 and 3-dimensional platforming, World 2's stages are much more open and focus on platforming in all dimensions. This immediately makes the rev roll far more useful this time around, as you can pull off some interesting tricks by using the 3D environment to close gaps. In addition to rev rolling and the butt bounce, Pac can also now do a flip kick in midair, which you may recognize as one of Pac-Man's aerials in Super Smash Bros. The metal power-up from Pac-Man World 1 reappears, as well as a shrinking power-up that's used to find some secrets. The bonus mazes are back once again, and this time they're closer to the arcade originals, as any collision with a ghost will kill you. Remember when I complained about how random the level themes could feel at times in the first game? Pac-Man World 2 manages to build a really cohesive progression through Pac-Land. Level themes will typically slowly transition into the next world. The forest becomes the treetops, frozen tundras will turn to mountains and then to a volcano, you get the picture. Even the music for each area tends to build upon or alter the previous track, with music becoming more and more complex as you get further into a world. It's a really cool use of adaptive music that, in combination with the level theming, creates this experience of a globe-trotting adventure all over Pac-Land from level to level. It's more than just the level design that's been altered here though. Collecting all items in a level is now a bit more incentivized here, and much more complex and demanding a task. Each level has hidden tokens, a certain amount of fruit to collect, and dots to grab. If you want 100%, you'll need to grab all the fruit and dots in a single run. Once you've beaten a particular level, you can run through it again as a time trial too. Beating the recommended time will give you another token. These tokens will unlock various rewards in Pac Village's arcade, like previous Pac-Man titles and a jukebox. With every level containing hundreds of dots and each fruit required for 100% completion, you really need to know each stage inside and out if you want that bonus token. And with collectibles becoming time-freezing stopwatches and a strict time limit to adhere to, time trials will also require a good balance of level knowledge and good reflexes and strategy. I typically don't like time trial modes in platformers, both 2D and 3D, but the change in the way the levels are played is more than just fun. It's a really nice way to break up the pace. Meticulously searching levels can be kind of draining if you're going for 100% right off the bat, but being able to use that knowledge of every collectible location and stage layout to try to sprint through the level in each time trial mode is super enjoyable and further uses the layout information you've already been gathering just by playing. It's not perfect though. With hundreds of dots in each level and loads of fruit, missing a single piece can be incredibly frustrating, especially considering you'll need a perfect run in order for the game to count your progress. You can't miss one dot or melon and then go back for it. You'll need to collect everything all in one go. This can be slightly frustrating even early on, especially as there's a glitch in an early level that prevents the game from counting collectibles correctly. If you gather the final fruits in Canyon Chaos and let the "you collected all" animations play over each other, the game gets confused. This problem only seems to appear in this level too, but it's far from the only issue. The new camera system is admittedly archaic and clunky for one thing, and although it's not debilitating, it certainly makes some challenges more irritating than intended. I got severe burnout trying to 100% Pac-Man World 2. By the time you hit the snow mountains, collecting everything can be extremely taxing. Between chase sequences where any micro mistake and missed dot can require an entire level restart, dot trails between platforms that sometimes take several jumps to grab, and automatic running sections, later levels can be a nightmare. And to make matters worse, I ran into a bug that makes one of the hardest levels even worse. I ran through Avalanche Alley taking detailed fucking notes of each dot and fruit to make sure I wasn't missing anything. And despite countless attempts where I collected everything according to my notes, the game always told me I missed a single dot. After a full day of attempts, I realized one of the checkpoints in the PlayStation 2 version is broken and would save your score before finishing a chain of dots, meaning a single death past this point and it would be impossible to grab the final dot and complete the level. I had to take a long break from Pac-Man World 2, and when I returned, I had completely given up on reaching 100% on any more levels, instead focusing purely just on progression, and I'm incredibly glad I did. While the lava world was a blast to platform through, the subsequent ocean world brought my enjoyment back down to nil. The first two of these levels have you automatically swimming forward, with the only available controls being a forward dash and moving out of the way of hazards. They're pretty awful on their own, and I'm eternally grateful I gave up on collecting everything before I reached these. But the ocean world only gets worse. The final two levels are on-rails shooter sections in the Pac-Marine sub. Once again, no control over progression and limited movement. Thank God the game begins to pick back up in the final world. Ghost Island only features one out of the ordinary level, which has you roller skating across a collapsing boardwalk. Compared to the other deviations to the normal 3D platforming, I actually really liked this one. The skating physics control really well, surprisingly enough. The final two levels are your more typical platforming affair before you reach the final confrontation with Spooky. After retrieving all the golden fruit, powered up Pac-Man takes on Spooky in a final multi-phase battle. You'll need to avoid attacks and chase Spooky until he's close enough to flip kick. Far less interesting than the battle with Talkman. The boss battles in general are nothing to write home about, which is why I haven't mentioned them before. I guess boring is better than the huge difficulty spikes of the previous game though. Pac-Man World 2 is a much better game than Pac-Man World 1. That may sound surprising considering my complaints, and yeah, I'll admit I had a pretty rough experience with it at times. But while Pac-Man 1 is consistently competent, Pac-Man World 2 refines every part of what made the original fun. Levels embrace 3D design even further, there's a far greater sense of exploration and collection, platforming and physics feel tighter and smoother, and even Pac-Man's weakest abilities have some newfound utility. The presentation's fantastic, the world's more immersive, and the music is far more bombastic and fun. When the game focuses on polishing this style, it succeeds in ways I find genuinely impressive. However, when it strays from this path a bit too much, mostly in the case of the miserable ocean levels, its lows do sink beneath the consistent quality of Pac-Man World 1. That's the most unfortunate part about this game. At its best, it really is a fantastic 3D platformer, but there are pitfalls here, both big and small, that result in painful bumps in an otherwise remarkable adventure. The worst part to me is that although I recognize this game's strengths, two tiny glitches and hours of frustration are what stand out to me most when I reflect on my time with Pac-Man World 2. If you're interested in 3D platformers, it is absolutely worth your time. It's the game I'd probably recommend the most out of anything I've covered in this series so far. But take my advice, skip the PlayStation 2 version if you're remotely interested in fully completing the game. And I highly suggest only going back to do so once you finish the final fight, as reaching 100% is kind of a miserable time. In addition to that, skip the GBA port too. It is a far departure from the console version and nothing more than a mediocre isometric platformer. Alright, so surely by now we've proven that Pac can platform with the best of them, right? Pac-Man World 3? No brainer, right? Right? The development of these games is such a mess. So, before we jump into Pac-Man World 3 and I talk about it, it's really important to know the context of its release, probably more so than any other game I've talked about so far. First off, a lot of the groundwork for the story and locations in World 3 actually came from a project called Pac-Man Adventures. We don't really know anything about how it was supposed to play, but the concept art, characters, and even some locations were reused for Pac-Man World 3. Honestly, I love all these sketches. Pac-Man Adventures was being storyboarded by none other than the legendary animator Don Bluth, who I'd imagine most of you may recognize as the guy behind Dragon's Lair. After being cancelled for whatever reason, Namco Home Tech decided to outsource Pac-Man World 3 to Blitz Games. They have a very, let's just say, spotty track record, with most of their stuff being mediocre licensed games. They also made Glover, I guess. But nonetheless, Pac-Man World 3 was in their hands. And thank God it was. So, during this time between 2005 to 2006, Namco and Bandai were working on merging into a brand new company, Namco Bandai, and yes, in case you're wondering, they decided to swap the name around to Bandai Namco a couple years later for whatever reason. But because of this merge, Namco was pulling the plug on pretty much every Pac-Man game in development. The only reason we got Pac-Man World 3 at all is because Blitz Games begged Namco to let them finish the project. And thankfully Namco said, sure. Namco then proceeded to let the team know that they only had until the end of 2005 and they would not be getting another cent to cover development costs. The fact that we got a game at all, let alone one that's complete, is frankly incredible, especially considering not every country did. The game was never localized in Japan since Namco didn't want to spend any more money or time to localize it. Blitz Games fought tooth and nail to get this game out, and now I guess it's about time to find out if it was worth it. Our third adventure opens just like the first. It's Pac-Man's 25th birthday, and once again he'll be missing out on the celebration. Unlike the first game, it's Pac-Man who disappears from his party as he's teleported by Orson into a trash pit. Orson explains that this creep named Irwin is attacking both Pac-Land and the Spectral Realm, siphoning energy from the ghost's home. If something isn't done, both of these worlds will collide, tearing the fabric of the universe apart. So, no pressure. Unlike the last two games, the story is told not just through cutscenes, but through fully voiced dialogue too. As Pac-Man runs through each level, destroying Irwin's spectral siphons and robot army, Pac and Orson tend to exchange a ton of dialogue and banter. I feel like I remember a ton of platformers from this era having this kind of buddy road trip vibe. In my humble opinion, I think the cast and performances are fantastic. Pac-Man sounds great.
Details of my sector's energy should be between me and Miss Pac. Thank you very much.
Orson sounds like a real nerd.
It's our home, too. Now can you see why I need your help?
And Blinky sounds just like a mob boss.
Yeah, the big red ghost gets himself all caged up so the yellow fella gets to mock. Go on then, Munchie, mock away.
Make no mistake, the game may call this guy Clyde and the orange ghost Blinky, but this is just a mistake that was left over from Pac-Man World 2. The writing doesn't fall too far behind either. Pac-Man's one-liners and quips can be a little eye-rollingly cheesy, but it's never too terrible. The only issue I have with the story is how jarring it feels for Pac-Man and Orson to be working together like this. Like I mentioned before, it feels like there's some sort of plot point missing between his defeat in World 1 and their team up in World 3 where they should have clashed and reconciled. The two really don't seem to hold much of any ill will towards each other, especially considering what happened in Pac-Man World 1. But as long as you can get past that oddity, it's a perfectly fine, albeit generic plot. Pac-Man's staple moves return once again. You can butt bounce to activate various switches and attack enemies, and the rev roll will send you speeding forward up slopes or activate various machinery. Butt bouncing 3 times in a row will even shoot out a little shockwave. Pac-Man has picked up some new fighting moves as well. By mashing the attack button, you can pull off a 3-hit combo for taking out enemies. Unfortunately, the flip kick from World 2 is sadly missing here. I think World 3 could have made some really good use out of it. All three of these moves are vital to taking on Irwin's forces. Compared to the previous two, Pac-Man World 3 is very, very combat heavy, almost like a 3D beat 'em up. Sometimes these guys can be avoided, but as the game progresses, enemies will often pop up in large waves that block your path until you manage to take every single one down. In addition to punches and bounces, there are several power pellets that will grant you temporary buffs. These range from invincibility to powering up your butt bounce, creating loops around enemies that explode, or tapping into Pac-Man's inner dark side. Thankfully, the classic platforming returns, and I'd say it rivals the levels of its predecessor. Jumping from place to place feels good, as long as you're not wrestling with the mediocre camera or fighting against the frame rate. This game really struggles to run at times. There can be quite a bit of slowdown. It wasn't unplayable, but it's definitely something I noticed. It might perform better on the PC or GameCube versions, but on PS2 it chugged quite frequently. Aside from combat, the main new mechanic is the fact that you can play as either Pinky or Blinky. You can swap to either one by performing a rev roll on these little platforms. Pinky can interact with these transparent ghost blocks and make them solid so Pac-Man can progress, and Blinky can make short work of Ghost without a power pellet or smash these large blocks with his sonic boo. Sections where you need to swap over to these guys are usually pretty rare, and while they're certainly not used to the fullest they could be here, they're an okay enough way to break up the monotony. One thing World 3 managed to greatly improve upon is the way it handles collectibles. Just like Pac-Man World 2, there's a select amount of fruit hidden in each level, as well as a single Galaxian that takes you to a special maze, 5 silver Pac-Man statues, and a collector's card. Collecting all fruit and collecting all 5 silver packs will each give you another collector's card. The Galaxians unlock mazes to play, just like last time, but they are exceptionally bare bones. Every collector's card represents a character, enemy, or location. The best change of all isn't necessarily the collectibles added though, it's what they have removed. The fact that obtaining every single dot is no longer required is a vast improvement over Pac-Man World 2. Collectibles in that game were great, but the fact that all dots were required as well made 100% completion a nightmare. World 3 hides each goodie pretty damn well, and being thorough is well rewarded. We've come a long way since Pac-Man World 1. The presentation hasn't really changed much since last time, but it's still well done. This time around though, areas are far darker and level themes are a lot less varied, most likely to cut down on development time and costs. If you visit an area, go ahead and assume you'll be back there again. You'll trek through ancient ruins, the Spectral Realm, an industrial tower, cliffs, and Irwin's fortress. A lot of these places give off a far more serious and darker vibe. The tone for the game as a whole tends to lean more towards being far more mysterious and dark. That may be a turnoff for some who prefer the cartoonish style of the previous adventure, but I honestly had no qualms with this. It's a bit surreal seeing the change from the two, but it's kind of refreshing. For better or worse, the experimentation of Pac-Man Worlds prior is gone here. No vehicle stages or underwater auto-scrollers. You'll jump into an updated Talkman mech for a tutorial and later a short battle, but they're merely just brief distractions. All in all, there's a solid enough foundation here, but even a solid foundation can't help you if you put everything in the wrong place. This game emphasizes combat far more than it has any right to, and while the enemies increase in health and numbers, you're stuck with the same 3-hit punch the entire time. Any confrontation quickly becomes an immediate slog. These guys get ranged lasers with crazy accuracy, shields, or they'll just fucking take 20 hits to kill. These metal scorpions are exceptionally durable, and they throw them at you like fucking candy. Late game stages tend to focus less on challenging or interesting platforming, and simply add a 6th wave to the already miserable, repetitive onslaught. I think a good comparison for Pac-Man World 3 is Ratchet & Clank, except you don't have a single weapon. Ratchet & Clank doesn't exactly have stellar combat, but at least experimenting and leveling up the weapons is fun. Instead, you're just going to get exceptionally familiar with that attack button. Even fighting enemies as Blinky doesn't change anything, you're just still spamming attacks, and if you die, rev roll on the platform to spawn immediately back in, no problem. It's monotonous at best, and absolutely mind-numbingly dull and frustrating at worst. Even the single Talkman stage was more than enough for me to despise that too. He just feels miserable to control, and it never feels like I can tell if I'm doing much of anything. Talkman may only take one level here, but it was enough to leave a horrid taste in my mouth. My other main complaint is this game's soundtrack. The music itself is completely fine. totally passable. But for whatever reason, 90% of the game is completely silent. Music tracks will just sometimes go MIA for the entire rest of the level. Surely this is not intentional, right? Or did they really want to lean hard into that darker atmosphere? Either way, compared with the tunes of 2 and even 1, Pac-Man World 3's soundtrack is kinda just forgettable. That's kind of all I have to say regarding the gameplay, so we're good, right? I may have said far more good about the game than bad, but let me tell you, the combat single-handedly dismantles this entire experience for me. Every single robot on screen, or suspiciously sectioned off power-up area, just filled me with dread. Even using a power pellet to chomp on ghosts just feels shitty. The game has this weird jarring pause whenever you chomp down, the ghost will flee into this swirling vortex, which hurts you if you go after it. It just feels bad. Even if we give a conservative estimate and say the game is 50-50 good platforming and horrible combat, the combat still takes exponentially longer than any platforming challenge. So the entire journey through feels like a tiny bite of good design in between the most soul-draining, uninteresting button mash fests. Even the bosses here are miserable. Compared to the previous games, there are just a measly 2, and they're almost identical to one another. And even they go on for far too long. You smash Irwin's little craft, he gets sucked into his machine, the day is saved. But you know what pisses me off? Even after 25 years and teaming up to work together, the game ends with Pac-Man gobbling down the Ghost Gang without a second thought. I just think it'd be nice after all these years to see these old rivals share a birthday cake, considering, they saved the world together. Wishful thinking, I guess. Orson doesn't even make a final appearance here before just fading away into obscurity. At least there's a story to enjoy, I guess. If you play the portable DS version, you miss out on pretty much all the dialogue. Still, I was honestly thoroughly impressed by this port. Don't get me wrong, it's absolutely inferior and by far the worst way to play. But it's surprisingly pretty faithful, and it feels way faster and smoother than the console version. Yeah, the DS version feels better than the PS2 version. Worse in every other regard though, no question. There are about 15 levels here to reach the finale of Pac-Man World 3, and the whole experience took me about 10 hours. But it felt like a century. In the end, I am glad that Blitz Games fought so hard for Pac-Man World 3. If you dig deep enough, there is some great stuff under the surface, but it is absolutely bogged down by miserable combat and just a general lack of paint and polish. I don't know that I can in good faith recommend it, but there is a lot of love for the series here buried deep beneath the exterior. The museum has this super cool interview with Toru Iwatani, and they've put some super deep cuts on this timeline here, including Pac-Man VR, which is still lost to my knowledge by the way, and the Mr. and Mrs. Pac-Man pinball machine. There's also a trailer here for Pac-Man World Rally, which was kind of a fun teaser considering it and other Pac-Man multiplayer games from this era will be the focus of the next episode. But for now, my journey through the Pac-Man World trilogy can finally come to a close. With Pac-Man World, Pac-Man clawed his way back into relevance. For the moment, he stood alongside the rest of the big boys like Mario and Crash Bandicoot. By the time the third game squeaked out a final breath for the series, Pac-Man and his platforming adventures came to a close. Pac-Man World 1 created a marvelous foundation. Pac-Man World 2 built upon that to create something impressive not just in the franchise but in games from the era as well. With Pac-Man World 3's final stand, everything had collapsed. But we're still not quite done with this era. Between these releases, while Pac-Man was briefly on top, we received a lot of spin-off titles trying to capitalize off of his newly gotten notoriety. Normally I'd be quite skeptical, but I could use something other than platforming as a good change of pace. Maybe these games will prove to be a fun distraction? Or perhaps I'm diving headlong into just another nightmare. Guess we'll have to wait and see. Until next time.